The gavel cracked against the oak lectern, a sound as final as a coffin nail. It was the spring of 1971, and the air over Old Man Hemming's farm tasted of damp earth, diesel exhaust, and sorrow. We stood in a loose semicircle around the auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a straw hat whose rhythmic patter was the only cheerful sound for miles. Farmers, neighbors, and bankers, men with hands like leather and eyes that could measure a field to the acre, kicked at the loose gravel of the driveway, their faces grim. Another one gone, another farm being carved up and sold to the highest bidder. I was there, leaning against the rusty fender of my Ford F-250, not to buy land, but to watch. My name is Frank Miller. I farmed the quarter section my grandfather had broken with a team of mules, and I did it with machinery that was already old when I bought it. In my pocket was a folded wad of cash, maybe $200, saved up from selling a few extra hogs. It was my war chest for the day, earmarked for parts, for a forgotten tool, for anything useful the vultures overlooked while they fought over the big-ticket items. The main event was the land. 80 acres of prime bottom ground, black as sin and flat as a tabletop, and right next to it, the machinery lineup. A nearly new John Deere 4320 tractor, its green paint still gleaming, sat beside a six-bottom plough that hadn't seen enough work to wear the shine off its mold boards. A Gleaner combine, just 2 seasons old, looked like a sleeping yellow giant. This was the equipment of a man who had bet big on the future. The auctioneer's call was the sound of that bet going bust. My cousin, Richard, was at the center of the action. Everyone called him Rich, and he was doing his best to live up to the name. He stood with the banker, Mr. Henderson, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. Rich was wearing a clean seed corn cap and a windbreaker that didn't have a single grease stain on it. He clapped Henderson on the back, laughing at something the auctioneer said, a big, confident sound that grated on the quiet solemnity of the day. "Look at that, Frank," a voice beside me muttered. It was old Gus Peterson, who farmed the section next to mine. "Your cousin's gonna buy the whole damn outfit." I just nodded, watching as Rich raised his hand, a quick, decisive gesture. The bidding for the 80 acres had climbed to a number that made my stomach clench. $400 an acre was a fortune. Rich bid $450. The crowd went silent. The other bidder, a man from 2 counties over, shook his head and stepped back. "Sold!" the auctioneer barked, pointing his gavel at Rich. "To Richard Miller, a young man with vision." A ripple of applause, thin and uncertain, went through the crowd. Rich beamed, shaking the banker's hand like he'd just won the county fair. He was buying the future on credit. Henderson was selling it to him. Next came the 4320. It was a beautiful machine, I had to admit. A 6-cylinder diesel with a power shift transmission, a closed-center hydraulic system, and a cab with a radio. It was everything my old John Deere 730 2-cylinder wasn't. My 730, the one my father bought used in '59, was loud, crude, and simple. It made a distinctive pop-pop-pop sound that you could hear a mile away. It had no cab, no radio, just a steel seat, and 2 levers to control the hydraulics. But it was paid for. Every nut, every bolt, every gallon of oil I put in it was mine. The bidding on the 4320 was fierce, but Rich was relentless. He didn't even seem to be listening to the numbers. He just kept nodding at the auctioneer until the other men dropped out, shaking their heads and muttering about the price of progress. He bought the tractor, the plough, and the Gleaner combine, signing the bank's paperwork on the hood of Henderson's Buick without even reading it. He saw me watching and sauntered over, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Well, Frank, picking through the scraps again?" he asked, his voice full of mock sympathy. "Just looking, Rich," I said, my voice level. "You ought to get with the times, cousin," he said, gesturing back at his new iron. "You can't farm in the 70s with 50s equipment. You got to get big or get out. Henderson will set you up. A man's got to use his assets." "The only asset I like is the one that's paid for," I replied, my eyes on the long tables of hand tools and spare parts at the far end of the line. Rich laughed, a short, sharp bark. "That kind of thinking is what put Hemmings in the ground. You're sitting on 200 acres of prime Iowa land, debt-free, and you're driving that old two-lunger. You're like a man dying of thirst while sitting on a well, too scared to lower the bucket." He clapped me on the shoulder, a hard, patronizing gesture. "Think about it. I'm going to run that new combine over Hemmings's 80 and my own ground. I'll have my crops out in a week while you're still tinkering with that old relic of yours." He walked away, back to his banker, the king of his newly purchased, debt-ridden kingdom. The other farmers watched him go, a mix of envy and admiration on their faces. They looked at me, then at my old truck, and I could see the pity in their eyes. They saw a man afraid of the future, a man being left behind. I waited until the crowd thinned, until the big machinery was rolled away to its new home. I walked the tables of junk, my eyes scanning for treasure. I found it in a dusty wooden crate, a complete set of proto-pullers and gear separators, heavy steel tools with a fine, machined finish. Barely used. Underneath them was a tap and die set in a metal case, every piece there. Old Hemmings had been a good mechanic. I got the whole lot for $15. Then I found what I was really hoping for. A 55-gallon drum of Rotella 15W40 oil, still 3/4 full. The auctioneer practically gave it to me for $5. As I loaded my meager winnings into the back of my Ford, I could hear the distant roar of a new diesel engine starting up. It was Rich, likely driving his 4320 home. The sound was smooth, powerful, and modern. It was the sound of money. I closed the tailgate, the rusty metal groaning in protest. I turned the key in my own ignition, and the old 3.5 V8 coughed to life, settling into a familiar, rumbling idle. It wasn't a new sound, but it was mine. Before we go any further with this story, I have to ask you folks listening, have you ever known a man like me, Frank, or maybe one like my cousin, Rich? Drop a comment below and tell me about the old iron you remember, the machines that had more heart than horsepower, and the men who ran them. I'd sure like to hear about it. The following year, 1972, was a wet one. The spring rains came and never seemed to leave, turning the fields into a thick, black gumbo that could suck a boot right off your foot. The smart money. The men like Rich with their big, four-wheel drive tractors and flotation tires were able to get into the fields during the few dry spells. They mudded the corn in, confident that their horsepower could beat the weather. I waited. My main tillage tractor was a 1951 Farmall M, a machine my father had prized for its simplicity and reliability. It had narrow front wheels and nowhere near the power of Rich's new fleet, but I knew it like the back of my own hand. I knew the specific growl it made under a heavy load, the way the steering wheel vibrated when the front tires hit a rock, the smell of its gasoline engine running a little too rich on a cold morning. But in that mud, it would have been useless. It would have buried itself to the axles. So I worked in my shop. The shop wasn't much, just an old wooden corn crib I'd resided with tin and poured a concrete floor in. But it was my sanctuary. I took the time to do the maintenance I'd been putting off. I pulled the valve cover on the M and adjusted the tappets, setting the clearance with a feeler gauge until each one was perfect. I drained the milky, contaminated hydraulic fluid and replaced it, cleaning the sump screen until it shone. I used the puller set I'd bought at the auction to replace a leaky axle seal on my John Deere 730. The neighbours would drive by and see my tractors sitting cold in the shed while the calendar pushed toward June. Rich stopped by one afternoon, his new pickup kicking up a spray of mud. "Still waiting for an invitation, Frank?" he called out from his truck window, a smirk on his face. "You're going to miss your planting window. You can't make money if the seed's still in the bag." "I'd rather have the seed in the bag than rotting in the ground," I told him, wiping grease from my hands with a red rag. He just shook his head and drove off, the sound of his modern engine fading down the lane. He didn't understand. He thought power was the answer to everything. He didn't see that sometimes the most powerful tool a farmer had was patience. When the weather finally broke in mid-June, the ground dried just enough. It was still heavy, but it was workable. I fired up the farmall M, its engine catching with a familiar, comforting rhythm. I hitched up my old 4-row International planter and went to work. The soil was still tough, and the M had to fight for every foot. I had to run it in a lower gear than I liked, the governor wide open, the exhaust stack puffing out little clouds of blue-grey smoke with each power stroke. But it pulled true. I was finishing up the last field, the sun setting behind the distant tree line, when it happened. There was a sharp crack, like a rifle shot, followed by a sickening metallic grinding sound. The engine seized instantly, the rear wheels locking up and skidding a foot in the soft dirt. A plume of white smoke, thick and acrid, billowed from under the hood. I killed the ignition and sat there in the sudden, ringing silence, my heart sinking into my boots. The smell of burnt oil and hot metal filled the air. I knew what it was before I even climbed down. A thrown rod. Catastrophic engine failure. My primary tractor was dead, right in the middle of my last 10 acres of planting. I walked home in the twilight, each step heavy. The next morning, I called the dealership in town. The parts man, a young kid who didn't know a farmall M from a garden tractor, laughed when I told him what I needed. "A connecting rod for an M?" he said. "Heck, we haven't stocked parts for those in 10 years. Might be one in a warehouse somewhere, but it'll take weeks to find it, if we can find it at all. You should think about trading at that thing in, Mr. Miller. We've got some real nice used 40-20s on the lot." I thanked him and hung up. Trading it in wasn't an option. Buying a 40-20 wasn't an option. The only option was the one my father had taught me. You fix what's broken. The work was brutal. I used the 730 and a chain to drag the crippled M back to the shop. I spent a full day just cleaning the grease and dirt off the engine block so I could work on it. Then, the tear-down began. I drained the oil, a black, gritty sludge full of metal shavings. I drained the coolant. I pulled the hood, the fuel tank, the radiator, and the valve cover. I carefully unbolted the cylinder head, a solid chunk of cast iron that took 2 of us, me and Gus Peterson, who had come over to see what the commotion was, to lift off the block. The damage was as bad as I'd feared. The number 3 connecting rod had snapped clean in 2. The broken end had flailed around inside the crankcase like a wild animal, shattering the piston, gouging the cylinder wall, and cracking the engine block from the oil pan rail up to the water jacket. "She's done for, Frank," Gus said, shaking his head slowly. "That block is toast. You'll never get that to hold water again." Anyone else would have agreed. Rich would have called the scrap yard and had it hauled away. But I saw something else. I saw a challenge. That tractor hadn't just been a machine. It was a part of the farm's history. It had fed my family for 20 years. I wasn't going to let it die on my watch. I spent the next 2 days on the phone, calling every salvage yard in a 3-state radius. I finally found what I needed in a dusty yard in southern Minnesota. A wrecked farmall Super M with a good engine block. The owner wanted $200 for the whole tractor. It was every penny I had, but I made the deal. I borrowed Gus's truck and trailer and spent a whole day driving up there and back, returning with the rusty, weed-choked carcass of the donor tractor strapped to the trailer. Then the real work began. I had to strip down 2 engines instead of 1. Piece by piece, I disassembled the donor engine, labeling every part, cleaning every bolt. The block was sound. I took it to a machine shop in the city, an old place run by a German immigrant who understood old iron. He magnafluxed the block to check for hidden cracks, bored the cylinders 30,000ths over, and turned the crankshaft. While he had the block, I worked on my own engine parts. I salvaged the good pistons and rods. I lapped the valves by hand, using grinding compound and a suction cup tool, until each one seated perfectly. I sat on a 5-gallon bucket in my shop, night after night, cleaning carbon off piston heads with a wire brush, scrubbing the oil galleries with rifle cleaning rods, making sure every surface was surgically clean. My wife, Sarah, would bring me dinner out in the shop. She'd watch me work, my hands stained black with grease, my face smudged. She never once told me to give up. She never once suggested I should just go to the bank like Rich. She just made sure my coffee cup was full and told me not to stay out too late. When I got the block back from the machine shop, it looked like a piece of art, its freshly honed cylinder walls gleaming, the deck surface perfectly flat. The reassembly was a slow, deliberate process. I installed the new wet sleeves, using soap and water as lubricant, tapping them gently into place with a wooden block. I plaster-gauged every single bearing, the mains and the rods, to ensure the oil clearance was exactly to spec. I torqued the head bolts in the proper sequence, going over them 3 times to make sure the head was seated evenly. It took me 3 solid weeks. 3 weeks while my last 10 acres went unplanted. 3 weeks of grease under my fingernails and the metallic taste of oil in my mouth. Finally, the day came. I filled the radiator with fresh coolant and the crankcase with the new oil I'd bought at the auction. I reconnected the fuel line and the battery cables. I took a deep breath, pulled out the choke, and hit the starter. The engine turned over, slow and heavy at first. It coughed once, twice, then roared to life. It wasn't the ragged, tired sound of an old engine. It was a crisp, powerful roar. I let it warm up, watching the oil pressure gauge, listening for any strange noises. There were none, just the steady, rhythmic beat of a healthy engine. I had done it. I had brought it back from the dead. I finished planting that last field, way too late in the season. The corn came up spindly and weak. My yield that year was the worst in the county. At the coffee shop, the talk was all about Rich Miller's bumper crop. He'd bought a brand new grain truck to haul it all. They'd see me come in, and the conversation would quiet down. They looked at me with that same pity from the auction. Frank Miller, the man who'd wasted a month fixing a worthless old tractor while his crop withered. I didn't say anything. I just drank my coffee, paid my bill, and went home. I knew something they didn't. My harvest may have been small, but it was all mine. Every last bushel was paid for. The years that followed were a blur of hard work and high prices. The early 70s were the boom years. In 1973, the Russians bought millions of tons of American grain, and the commodity markets went wild. The price of corn doubled, then tripled. Soybeans shot up to levels no one had ever dreamed of. It was like a gold rush, and the farmers of America had struck the mother lode. For men like my cousin Rich, it was a license to print money. With the profits from his first big year on the Hemmings place, he didn't pay down his debt. He doubled down. He bought another 160 acres that came up for sale down the road, paying $1,000 an acre, a price that made the old-timers gasp. He traded in the 2-year-old John Deere 4320 for a brand-new International Harvester 1466, a monster of a tractor with a turbocharged engine that screamed like a jet. He built a new machine shed, a massive steel building that dwarfed his house. He put up 2 new grain bins with a state-of-the-art drying system and a leg elevator. Every time I saw him, he was in something new. A new pickup truck, a new planter, a new disc. His farm looked like a dealer's lot. The banker, Mr. Henderson, was his best friend. They went on fishing trips to Canada together. Henderson held Rich up as an example of what a modern, progressive farmer should be. "You see what Rich Miller is doing?" he'd say at the bank. "He's leveraging his equity. He's expanding. He's not afraid to use the bank's money to make money." Then he'd look at me as I came in to make a payment on my small, yearly operating loan. And he'd shake his head with a sigh. "Frank, you had a good year. Prices are high. You should be thinking bigger. That land of yours is worth a fortune now. You could borrow against it, buy that piece next to you. Get yourself a new tractor." "I'm doing all right, Mr. Henderson," I'd say. "All right isn't good enough in this game," he'd reply, his voice taking on a fatherly, disappointed tone. "The train is leaving the station, Frank. You're standing on the platform counting your change." I ignored him. The high prices were a blessing, no doubt about it. For the first time in my life, we had real money in the bank. But my father's words were always in the back of my mind. "Son, never mistake a bull market for genius, and never bet the farm, because the farm is all you've got." So I stayed my course, I took the profits, and I reinvested them, but not the way Rich did. I didn't buy more land. I made the land I had better. I spent $10,000, cash, to pattern tile the 40 acres in the west field that had always been too wet. It was an enormous expense, but it was a permanent improvement. The next year that field gave me the best yields on the whole farm. I didn't buy a new tractor, but I did upgrade. I found a well-maintained John Deere 4010 diesel from the mid-60s at a retirement auction. It was a big step up from the Farmall M in terms of power and comfort, but it was still a simple, reliable machine that I could fix myself. I paid for it with a single check. The owner, a man in his 70s with hands gnarled by arthritis, looked at the check and then at me. "You take care of her," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's been a good old girl." I promised him I would. My neighbors saw me tiling the field and shook their heads. "Can you believe it?" I heard one of them say at the feed store. "Frank Miller's burying his money in the ground. Rich is buying the ground itself." They saw me drive by on my used 4010, and they saw a man who lacked ambition, a man who was too cheap to buy a new machine. The scorn was constant, but quiet. It was in the way other farmers would stop talking when I walked up. It was in the way Rich would wave from the air-conditioned cab of his new Steiger 4-wheel drive, a giant green beast he'd bought in '75. It was a wave that said, "Look at me. Look at what you could have." But I was also noticing things they weren't. The price of everything was going up. The fuel I put in my tractors cost twice what it had 3 years earlier. The price of fertilizer was astronomical, driven up by the 1973 oil crisis. The new tires I had to buy for my combine cost me a fortune. The parts for my machinery, when I could find them, were climbing in price every month. The papers were calling it inflation. One evening, I was in the shop, rebuilding the carburetor on my old Ford pickup. The radio was on, tuned to the station out of Des Moines. A man with a serious voice was talking about the Federal Reserve and interest rates. He said the chairman of the Fed was determined to whip inflation, even if it meant raising interest rates to unprecedented levels. He used phrases like prime rate and variable rate loans. Sarah came in with a glass of iced tea. "What are you listening to?" she asked. "Just the news," I said, carefully seating a new gasket. "They're talking about interest rates." "Is that bad?" she asked. I turned and looked at her, then out the open shop door toward the west, in the direction of Rich's sprawling, immaculate farmstead. All that new paint, all that steel, all that land. None of it was his. It all belonged to the bank. He was just renting it. And the rent, I had a feeling, was about to go up. "For some people," I said, turning back to my work, "it's going to be very, very bad." The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and red. It was beautiful, but it looked like the sky was on fire. It looked like a warning. The first sign of trouble wasn't a banker's letter or a dip in the markets. It was the sky. The summer of 1979 started with a brassy, cloudless glare that settled over the cornfields and refused to leave. The rains of May dried up, and June baked the topsoil into a fine grey powder. By July, the corn leaves, which should have been broad, green flags reaching for the sun, were curled tight as cigars, a desperate attempt to conserve what little moisture they had. The heat was a physical presence, a weight that shimmered over the roads and silenced the birds at midday. My tiled fields held on longer than most. The investment I'd buried in the ground years before was paying a dividend now, holding the deep moisture like a sponge. My corn was stressed, but it was alive. Rich's fields were a catastrophe. His high-yield varieties, planted thick and fed a heavy diet of nitrogen, were the thirstiest of all. They were burning up, the bottom leaves turning a sickly, parchment yellow. His operation was built for maximum yield in perfect conditions, and it had no resilience for a year like this. I saw him one afternoon at the co-op, where he was picking up a hydraulic filter for his Steiger. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a twitchy, hunted look. His face was thin, and there were new lines etched around his eyes. "Tough year," I said, by way of a greeting. "It'll rain," he snapped, not looking at me. "It has to." He paid for the filter with a credit slip, his signature a frantic scrawl, and left without another word. The rain didn't come. August was a furnace. The soybeans in the field stopped growing, the pods setting with only 1 or 2 tiny beans inside. The talk at the coffee shop turned grim. Men who had been bragging about their new 4-wheel drive tractors a year ago were now speaking in hushed tones about fuel costs and input loans. Then came the second blow. In early 1980, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the president announced a grain embargo. The export market, the very foundation of the 70s boom, vanished overnight. The price of corn at the local elevator fell 30 cents a bushel in a single day. Then another 20. It was like the floor had dropped out from under us. We were facing the prospect of harvesting a drought-ravaged crop that was worth less than it cost to plant. The final piece of the trap was sprung by men in suits 1,000 miles away. To fight the runaway inflation that had plagued the country for years, the Federal Reserve began to raise interest rates. The prime rate, the number that governed all other loans, started to climb. 8%, 12, 15. It kept going, a relentless, terrifying ascent. For me, it was an inconvenience. The interest on my small, annual operating loan went up, and it hurt. For Rich, it was a death sentence. His entire empire, the land, the machinery, the grain bins, was financed on variable rate loans. I did the math one night at my kitchen table. On his millions of dollars in debt, a 1% increase in the interest rate meant tens of thousands of dollars in extra payments a year. With the rate now pushing toward 20%, the numbers became astronomical, impossible. The breaking point came during harvest. It was a miserable affair. The combines crawled through the stunted, brittle stalks, the yield monitors barely registering. One afternoon, I was working on my old John Deere 95 combine, replacing a worn sickle bar, when I saw Gus Peterson's pickup tearing down my lane, kicking up a plume of dust. He skidded to a stop by the shop. "Frank, you got to see this," he said, his face pale. "It's Rich's Steiger." I rode with him over to the edge of Rich's property. The giant green tractor was sitting dead in the middle of a half-harvested cornfield. Rich was standing beside it, his hands on his hips, just staring at it. The dealership service truck was there, and two mechanics in greasy coveralls had the tractor's massive planetary final drive pulled apart, gears and bearings laid out on a canvas tarp. "What happened?" I asked Gus. "Final drive went out," he said, shaking his head. "Took out the whole axle housing. The dealer just gave him the estimate, $22,000 to fix it, and they can't get the parts for at least 2 weeks. $22,000. It was more than I'd paid for my whole farm." I watched as Rich had a heated conversation with the lead mechanic. He was waving his arms, his voice sharp and angry. The mechanic just shrugged, wiped his hands on a rag, and started packing up his tools. They couldn't do anything for him. They climbed into their truck and drove away, leaving Rich alone in the field with his broken, multi-ton monument to progress. He sank to his knees in the dirt and put his head in his hands. He had $100,000 in crop still standing in the field, and his only way of harvesting it was dead. And he didn't have $22,000. He didn't even have $2,200. The winter that followed was the quietest I can ever remember. The usual bustle of farmers hauling grain, buying fertilizer for the next season, and fixing machinery was gone. The roads were empty. A deep and profound gloom had settled over the countryside. The word foreclosure was no longer a whisper. It was a common headline in the county paper. The farm crisis had arrived. It started with a few smaller operators, men who had stretched themselves too thin. Then it began to claim the bigger ones, the ones everyone thought were untouchable. The bank, once so eager to lend, was now ruthless in its collections. Mr. Henderson's friendly smile was gone, replaced by the grim, tight-lipped expression of an undertaker. Land values, which had been the collateral for all that debt, collapsed. Ground that had been selling for $2,000 an acre in 1978 couldn't find a buyer at $900. Men like Rich were trapped. They owed more on their land than it was worth, and with commodity prices in the gutter and interest rates in the stratosphere, they had no way to make the payments. The notice appeared on a cold, grey morning in March of 1981. It was tacked to a fence post at the end of Rich's driveway, the white paper stark against the weathered wood. It was a public notice of a sheriff's sale. The bank had called his loans. Everything was to be sold: the land, the house, the machinery, the tools in the shop. Everything. The day of the auction was a bitter mirror of the Hemmings sale 10 years earlier. The sky was the color of lead, and a cold wind whipped across the yard, rattling the bare branches of the oak trees. The crowd was different this time. There were fewer neighbors and more strangers, men in clean boots and expensive coats, investors from the city, professional liquidators. They had the look of predators who had smelled blood in the water. The local farmers who were there stood in small, silent groups, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and sorrow. They weren't here to bid. They were here to bear witness, to watch the unthinkable happen, knowing that any one of them could be next. Rich was there, but he was a ghost. He stood near the back porch of the house he'd grown up in, his wife beside him, her arm linked through his as if to hold him up. He was wearing a worn flannel shirt and muddy boots. The confident, swaggering man from a decade ago was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shell. His eyes were vacant, staring at nothing. The auctioneer, the same man from all those years ago, started with the small items, his fast-talking patter sounding obscene in the funereal atmosphere. Tools were sold for pennies on the dollar. Shop equipment went for scrap prices. Then came the machinery line. The big International 1466, its red paint faded from the sun, sold for a third of what Rich had paid for it. The giant Steiger, still sitting with its final drive in pieces, was bought by a salvage dealer for its scrap value. I watched as 10 years of ambition, 10 years of chasing the future, was dismantled and sold off in less than an hour. I survived. It wasn't easy. My income was slashed, and money was tighter than it had been in years. But my foundation was solid. My land was paid for. My machinery, old and simple, kept running. When a wheel bearing went out on my 4010, I didn't have to call a dealer. I drove to the parts store, bought a $30 bearing and 2 new seals, and had it fixed myself in 3 hours. The rebuilt Farmall M became my main tillage tractor again, its steady, reliable power a comfort in uncertain times. My fuel bills were half of what my neighbors were paying. My biggest expense, the mortgage payment, didn't exist. Sarah and I didn't live extravagantly, but we ate every night, the lights stayed on, and we slept soundly, unafraid of a letter from the bank. We were an island of black ink in a sea of red. Finally, the auctioneer moved to the main event. The land. It was sold in parcels. The Hemmings place went first, bought by an insurance company from Des Moines. Then the quarter section Rich had bought in '74. Another corporate buyer. Rich didn't even flinch. It was as if he were already gone. Then the auctioneer announced the last parcel. All right, folks, this is the home place. The original 80 acres. House, barns, and some of the best ground in this county. A hush fell over the crowd. This was different. This wasn't just an investment. This was a legacy. This was the land that Rich's grandfather, my grandfather's brother, had first broken with a team of horses. The bidding started low. A man representing the bank opened at $500 an acre. An investor from Chicago countered. The numbers climbed slowly, painfully. 800, 850, 900. The Chicago man bid $925. The auctioneer scanned the crowd. 9.25. Do I hear 950? 950 anywhere? He looked around, his gavel raised. Going once, going twice. I raised my hand. My voice was clear and steady. 1,000. A gasp went through the crowd. All eyes turned to me. Rich's head snapped up, his vacant eyes focusing on me for the first time all day. The banker, Henderson, stared at me in disbelief. The man from Chicago looked irritated, conferring with his associate. The auctioneer grinned. $1,000 is the bid, from Frank Miller. Now we're having an auction. The Chicago man shook his head and stepped back. He had his limit, and this had just become more than a business transaction. Sold! The auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking through the cold air. For $1,000 an acre to Frank Miller. I didn't look at anyone. I walked to the clerk's table, my checkbook in my hand. I had spent years saving for this moment, though I never knew what form it would take. The money I'd made in the good years, the money I hadn't spent on new iron or more land, the money I had carefully put away, was now buying back a piece of my family's soul. After the paperwork was signed, I looked for Rich. He was gone. I found him in the old barn, the one our grandfathers had built together. He was sitting on an overturned bucket, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The barn was empty, stripped of everything but the smell of old hay and manure. I stood there for a long moment, the silence broken only by his grief. He looked up, his face streaked with tears and dirt. "Did you come to gloat, Frank?" he whispered, his voice raw. "Did you come to tell me you were right?" I shook my head. I walked over and sat on a hay bale across from him. "No," I said softly. "I came to talk about next year." He stared at me, confused. "Next year? There is no next year. It's over. I've lost everything." "You lost the debt," I corrected him. "The land is still here. This barn is still standing." I took a deep breath. "I'm going to need someone to run this place. Someone who knows this ground better than anyone. Someone I can trust." He looked at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, fragile hope that was painful to see. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the house is yours to live in, for as long as you and your family need it. Rent-free for the first year until you get back on your feet. And I'm offering you a job, working with me. We'll farm it all together." He was speechless. He just stared at me. The man he had mocked and pitied for a decade. He, the progressive farmer, the man with vision, was being offered a lifeline by the cousin he'd called a relic. "Why?" he finally managed to ask, his voice cracking. "After everything, why would you do this?" "Because it's what family does," I said. "And because you're a good farmer, Rich. You just got caught in a bad storm. I had a better anchor." He broke down completely then. But this time, it wasn't the sound of despair. It was the sound of a weight, a crushing, unbearable weight, finally being lifted. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm crisis slowly receded, leaving deep scars on the community, but also a hard-won wisdom. My farm, now larger, prospered. Rich worked alongside me, a changed man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet competence and a profound humility. He became a better mechanic than I was, his natural intelligence finally applied to understanding how things worked instead of just how to buy them. He taught his own son how to weld, how to time an engine, how to listen for the subtle change in sound that signals a problem. My shop became a neighborhood hub. Men who had once driven past without a glance now stopped in, a broken part in their hand, asking for help. "Frank, my planter's down, and the dealer wants $500 for a new hydraulic motor. You got any ideas?" We'd figure it out together, often machining a new bushing or welding a cracked housing, keeping their old iron running, keeping their families fed. The pity in their eyes had been replaced by respect. Gus Peterson said it best one afternoon. "We all thought you were stuck in the past, Frank. Turns out you were the only one ready for the future." One warm autumn evening, years later, my own son, now 16, was in the shop with me. He was working on the old farmall M, the one I had brought back from the dead so long ago. He was carefully setting the valve lash, his young hands moving with a confidence that made my heart ache with pride. "Dad," he said, not looking up from his work, "why do we still keep this old thing? It's slow. It doesn't even have a cab." I walked over and put my hand on the tractor's faded red hood, the metal still warm from the day's work. "This tractor taught me the most important lesson I ever learned," I told him. "It taught me that what you own is more important than what you owe. It taught me that the ability to fix something with your own two hands is a type of wealth the bank can never take away." I left him to his work and walked out to the edge of the yard. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the harvested fields. My fields. And beyond them, the fields that had once belonged to Rich, now healed and productive again. From the far side of the farm, I heard a familiar sound drift across the evening air. It was the distinctive, rhythmic pop, pop, pop of the old John Deere 730. Rich was on it, pulling the last wagon of soybeans in from the field, his son riding on the fender beside him. It wasn't the roar of a turbocharged diesel. It wasn't the sound of progress or power. It was the sound of resilience, the sound of survival. It was the heartbeat of a farm that had endured the storm and emerged, not just whole, but stronger. And it was the sweetest sound in the world.